Long before fields were planted or towns were built, people lived at the edge of hunger. Meat spoiled fast, fish turned in hours. Then a simple accident became knowledge. Where natural salt lay on rocks or in dried-up pools, meat lasted longer. Rubbing it in changed everything. It drew moisture out. It slowed rot. For the first time, food could outlast the day it was caught. Once that link was learned, it spread the way survival tips always spread. A successful hunt stopped being a feast that ended in waste. It became a store. Strips of meat could be kept, carried, and eaten later. Fish could be saved for lean weeks. The old rhythm of life shifted. People no longer depended entirely on the next kill or the next lucky catch. A surplus became real. That surplus did more than fill bellies. It changed decisions. Groups could stay put a little longer because stored food bought time. Travel could be planned because rations could be packed. Sharing rules changed because preserved food could be counted and divided. Salt did not create more animals or more fish. It created reliability, and reliability was the first step toward everything that came after. As farming settled people in one place, salt stopped being an accident of the landscape and started becoming a job. Communities learned which springs left a crust on stones, which streams tasted sharp, which ponds dried into white edges. They carried brine home instead of wandering for it. Then they did something new. They timed it. When heat returned and water dropped, families worked together to turn salty water into solid salt. Brine got boiled in clay pots when fuel allowed it and spread in shallow pans when sun and wind did the work for free. Each method demanded planning. Pans had to be shaped, watched, and protected from rain. Firewood had to be gathered before the boil. And where salt hid underground, people dug for it, chipped it out, hauled it up, and broke it down into usable pieces. Salt production became seasonal labor, not luck. That season changed the whole idea of food. Meat slaughtered at the right time lasted beyond the moment. Fish caught in a burst did not have to be eaten immediately. Grain and vegetables still mattered, but salt made them safer to store beside animal protein. The result was simple and huge. Settled communities fed more people through bad weeks and lean months. Preservation turned into a planned industry, and survival started running on schedules. Once salt production went beyond a family's needs, it stopped being just a supply for winter and started acting like wealth. Some communities sat near coastal flats or strong brine springs and reliably made more than they could use. That extra salt mattered because it solved a problem everyone shared. Food spoilage. Inland villages wanted it, but they did not have it. A trade gap opened, and people moved to fill it. At first, exchanges stayed close. Then, the stakes rose. Salt travelled farther because it bought things that were harder to produce locally. Grain kept a town fed when harvests failed. Metals became tools, blades, and status. Livestock meant meat, milk, hides, and labour. Salt became the item that could be carried out and traded back for everything else. Each successful trip proved the route, and the next trip followed it. Regular movement turned scattered deals into a system. Coastal producers sent salt inland in predictable loads, and inland towns gathered surplus grain and animals at set meeting points. Paths that had once served occasional travel now carried repeated traffic, season after season. People learned distances, safe water, and dependable stopping places because mistakes cost real value. The result linked far-off communities into routines, and salt sat at the center of that new connection. Once salt moved in bulk, rulers noticed something important. Everyone needed it, and they needed it all year, so states stepped in. They stopped treating salt like a private household supply and started treating it like a public resource to manage. Officials set standard weights and volumes. They counted sacks, sealed jars, marked batches. The goal stayed simple: make salt legible, so it could be controlled. Measurement led straight to rationing. Authorities decided who received salt first, how much each group could buy, and when markets could sell it. In hard seasons, those limits tightened. In good seasons, they loosened. Either way, the state sat in the middle, and once the flow of salt passed through official hands, taxation followed naturally. A fee at the pan, a charge at the gate, a toll on the road. Salt taxes worked because they stayed predictable. Grain harvests failed, raids disrupted trade, but salt demand rarely disappeared because food still had to last. Governments used that steady stream to plan spending, pay administrators, and keep stores for soldiers and workers. The mineral did not just season meals anymore, it underwrote budgets. Salt turned from a daily need into something closer to a guaranteed public income. Once salt became a steady tax prize, moving it stopped being a simple trade problem and turned into a state project. Heavy loads needed predictable paths, not guesswork. Governments marked key routes, cleared bottlenecks, and set rules for who carried what and when. Merchants followed the safest line, even if it ran longer, because a lost shipment meant ruin. A road that protected salt protected the budget. These routes hardened into salt roads, regular corridors where wagons, pack animals, and riverboats moved on schedule. Way stations appeared at fixed intervals, not as comforts, but as tools. They stored salt under guard, weighed it again, and kept records that matched tax claims. Fresh animals replaced exhausted ones. Repairs happened where traffic demanded it. With each checkpoint, salt became easier to move and harder to steal or hide. Protection followed the money. Patrols and escorts reduced bandit attacks, and penalties rose for tampering with sealed loads. Toll points and inspection posts turned travel into a controlled process, so traders paid for certainty as much as for access. Towns along the corridor grew useful and then powerful because every shipment stopped, rested, and got counted. One mineral ended up shaping where people travelled, settled, and invested. Once governments controlled the main routes, they also controlled the tap. Rulers claimed salt as a state right, not a market good, and they built monopolies that forced producers and traders through official hands. That decision changed everything. When one office set the rules, it also set the price. A pinch of salt on a meal now carried a second ingredient: obedience. Price controls looked simple on paper. In practice, they decided who ate well and who went without. Authorities fixed rates to keep cities calm or raised them to squeeze more revenue from every household. Licenses limited who sold salt. Inspections punished anyone who undercut the state, and penalties reached beyond merchants to ordinary buyers. A daily necessity became a counted, policed commodity. The sharpest weapon was the cut-off. Leaders restricted shipments to rebellious towns, punished rivals by blocking access to salt pans or mines, and made shortages do the work of soldiers. Meanwhile, the same system funded armies that enforced the policy in the first place. Taxes on salt turned diets into budgets, and budgets into campaigns. Control of salt meant control of people. In the medieval era, cities expanded and pulled in people who no longer grew their own food. Urban life ran on markets, and markets needed goods that lasted. Fresh meat spoiled fast. Fresh fish spoiled even faster. Salt solved that problem in one blunt step. It bought time. It let a catch from the coast reach inland tables days later. As towns grew, the need for preserved food stopped being occasional. It became daily. Then the calendar tightened its grip. Across much of Christian Europe, religious rules demanded many days without meat, and those rules shaped what people ate. Fish filled the gap, but only if it could be stored and moved. That pushed salted herring, cod, and other preserved fish into constant demand, especially in winter and during long fasts. The result was simple and harsh. When the church set the rhythm, salt carried the weight. For working families, salt meant the difference between having something reliable to eat and having nothing. Salted fish, salted pork and pickled foods stretched wages because they did not rot overnight. But that dependence also created a pressure point. If salt supplies tightened or prices rose, city households felt it immediately, one meal at a time. In the medieval market, salt stopped being just an ingredient. It acted like infrastructure for survival. In the early modern period, governments leaned harder on salt taxes because they worked. Everyone needed salt, so the money arrived fast and predictably. But that certainty came from a daily bite. A tax on salt did not feel like a distant fee on trade. It felt personal, like paying rent on survival. As rates rose and rules tightened, resentment stopped being quiet. It turned into a practical question. How did people avoid paying? Smuggling answered that question. When official salt became expensive, illegal salt became a business. Producers hid extra batches. Traders moved sacks at night, across borders and through back roads, selling to towns that could not afford the legal price. Black markets spread because they did more than save money. They restored control. The state responded with inspectors, seizures, and harsh penalties. That pressure did not end the trade, it professionalized it. Along coasts, the fight grew sharper. Ships and small boats moved salt and other goods past checkpoints, and raids targeted stores and convoys tied to the tax system. Communities sometimes protected smugglers because they looked less like criminals and more like suppliers. The line between law and livelihood blurred. Every crackdown risked a backlash, and every backlash forced authorities to spend more to enforce a tax meant to fund the state. Salt stayed on the table, so did anger. The old world depended on salt because time acted like an enemy. Meat spoiled, fish turned fast, winter and distance punished anyone without a way to hold food. Then industry changed the rules. Ice houses improved. Then mechanical refrigeration arrived, first in factories and ships, and later in shops. Cold slowed decay without packing everything in crystals. Preservation stopped meaning salt first, salt always. At the same time, canning spread from a clever experiment into a system. Food got cooked, sealed, and stored for months without turning. Railroads and steamships moved these sealed supplies farther and faster than caravans ever could. Cities no longer had to lean on barrels of salted fish to survive gaps in harvests. Diets shifted, quietly but completely, toward fresher meat, vegetables, and new packaged staples. That new reliability hit the salt powers where it hurt. In control. If families could keep food with ice, tins, and regular deliveries, they depended less on the old taxed salt channels. Monopolies weakened because the threat of shortage weakened. Governments still collected revenue, but salt lost its grip as a pressure point, and at the dinner table, the harsh taste of survival began to fade into choice. By the time modern industry settled in, salt stopped acting like a gatekeeper of life and death. Mines ran deeper, evaporation worked at scale, and railways and ships moved bulk loads with routine efficiency. The price kept falling, and the old leverage faded with it. When nearly everyone could get salt, governments stopped treating it like a pressure point. A basic need turned into a standard commodity. That change did not just affect budgets, it rewired daily life. In many places, salt entered homes through ordinary shopping instead of guarded storehouses, permits, and tariffs. A handful in a recipe no longer carried the weight of a tax or a threat. The roads and patrols once built to control salt still existed, but they served larger economies now. Salt no longer decided who ate and who waited. In the present, the argument around salt shifted from politics to health. People still needed it, but the fear focused on blood pressure, processed food, and how much was too much, not on whether it could be afforded at all. Supermarkets offered it in endless forms, cheap and stacked high, as if it had never been scarce. The same mineral that once bankrolled states and fueled conflict ended as a quiet, everyday choice.